First of all, I want to thank you for coming and taking time out of your day to come and hear me ramble about stuff. We've got some graduate students, we've got some undergraduate students, we've got some staff, we've got some faculty, so this is awesome. The other reason I want to say thank you is mostly to faculty. When I was at UMKC, it's probably my second year there, thanks David. I was probably my second year there. A colleague returned from sabbatical. And Amber Lee, hi. A colleague returned from sabbatical. And at the faculty meeting, Phil, welcome back, it's nice to see you back. Would you like to tell us about your sabbatical? And he sort of looked around and he said, I read many books and I thought deep thoughts. And I started to laugh until that's as far as it went. I read many books and I thought deep thoughts. And there was no presentation, there was no publication ever came from it. I read many books and I thought, wait a minute. I took on being undergraduate advisor for a year, so you could go read many books and think deep thoughts. Because the thing is, my colleagues have to take on extra work, maybe not much, but a little bit, in order for me to have the privilege of going away for a while and reading many books and thinking deep thoughts. So it seems a reasonable thing to say is to thank you to them for that privilege, because tenure is not, or sabbatical is not a sovereign right; it's a privilege that we're afforded. So I did go away and I did read many books and I did think deep thoughts, and I'm going to tell you about some of them now. I'm going to apologize ahead of time because I have 1,200 pages of single-spaced type notes. And stuff. This is the first time I've tried to crystallize it into anything. So if it seems just a little bit rambling at times, please understand that this is a work in progress. I'd never had a sabbatical, so I was 11 years before I had a sabbatical. So people said, like Shao asked me one day, how was your sabbatical? And I said, well, it was my first one, so I have no real basis for comparison. But I think on balance, if I had to say it was a success, I would. So, convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. I teach religious studies, so this seems a fairly reasonable motto to at least bear in mind, if not live by. It was written in 1888, the last sane year of Nietzsche's life, and it became it became so obvious to me during the work that I did while I was on sabbatical that I actually wrote it on a little index card and stuck it up over my computer because, hopefully you'll see. So there are 3 books that will likely come out, rather than produce anything. I mean, I edited 10 books in 10 years and about 50 articles and essays, so I was pretty much burned out and the well was dry. So I thought, I'm going to produce 3 more books on my sabbatical. And went, well, I can write or I can ride my motorcycle. Yeah. Okay, I can write later. And so I didn't actually get anything, I got some articles written, but I didn't get anything serious produced. But I did lay the groundwork, which I think, as I understand what a sabbatical is, it's a pretty good use of a sabbatical. So one of the books that's going to come out of it is a short book, 60,000 words, so an academic press wants it. Why Atheism Matters, as part of the national discourse on religion. Another book that Judy's very excited about is The Heretic's Guide to Religion and Film. How many of you have seen The Matrix? Okay, we all know the scene where Morpheus offers the red and the blue pill to Neo, right? This choice or that choice. I want a third pill. Okay? And that's what this book is about. It's about how do we ask different questions? Because too often, religion and film is really just a bootleg term for religion and theology, particularly religion and Christian theology, particular religion and conservative Christian theology. Oh, look, he fell down with his arms spread out like this. He must be a Jesus figure. Well, no, sometimes a dead guy is just a dead guy. Okay, so those. But here's why you're really here. I'd like to think, that this is going to be a longer project, and I'm just in the initial stages of getting to the point where I can see what it looks like mean, anybody who's written a dissertation or long extended research projects, you know what I'm talking about. There's a point when you can't quite see it yet, but then you get that sense of it. Well, I'm at that sense of it. And an ecological model of social cognition is what the technical, pedantic, boring as whale snot academic term for it would be, but that's not why you're here. Here's why you're here. What cult porn and UFOs can teach us about the way we think, because that's what I'm interested in. How is it that we think about these things? And why do we think the way we do? So, think about the term cults for a moment. And I put it in scare quotes because my basic position is there's no such thing as cults. It's also my basic position there's no such thing as pornography. And there's no such thing as UFOs. What there are is a bunch of different understandings of what those things are that come together and create this fuzzy little cloudy concept that we all point to and we think, that's what it is. So, new religions, if you ask a Scientologist, there's very few Scientologists, I have to tell you this, they will not say we go to the cult down the block. Right? If you go to members of new religion, you say, well, where do you go to, where do you worship? Well, we go to the cult on the corner. They won't say that. Right? They say we're the fastest growing religion in the world or whatever. But then you've got dedicated counter movements, both secular and religious, that basically it's like the last scene of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where Donald Sutherland has been taken over by the creatures, and he goes, ah, a cult, right? So they call them cults, but they're clearly not going to agree on what they are. Then you got the media, which is basically just trying to sell advertising, the state, which is trying to earn votes, the academy, which is sometimes helping, sometimes not, and what I call bystanders. You all, if you're not interested in your religions, right? And all of these stakeholder groups have a stake in defining what this is. And what they're going to do is they're going to define it a little bit differently. It's kind of like a hologram. This is where this whole idea started when I learned how holograms were made. Holograms are what are called interference patterns. A laser fires a light through a beam splitter, splits it into two. One part of it, which is unaffected by anything, comes off a mirror, focused through a lens, hits this piece of holographic film. Another part of it is focused through a lens, comes off another mirror, hits a target object, which then bounces it back. And what creates the hologram is what optical physicists call an interference pattern. And sometimes it can be simple like that, it can be more complex. You can have two beam splitters, you can have polarizers, you can have all kinds of crap in there. But the thing is, you're still creating this interference pattern. There's no one single thing that is producing the image. And I think that's a nice analogy for the way social cognition works when it comes to things like cults, porn, UFOs. And the great thing about this, if I can pull this off, and there's no guarantee that I can, so I'm not that smart, but if I can pull this off, this is actually a theoretical model that people can take and you can plug whatever you're interested into the center. Poverty, violence, you plug your issue into the center, and there should be a way that it can be useful. And I think that's a fairly, reasonable thing to offer. So, back to cults. The anti-cult movement and the counter-cult movement, what I've done here is I'm actually giving you a little more, it's not completely to scale, but a little more sense of who contributes most to the discussion. Because if you do social networking diagrams, you all had to do those in sociology, right? And you go like, if you're closer to somebody and the branch is thicker, it means you're closer. You can do the same sort of thing here. That's where most people, how many of you know a Scientologist? And know that you know? Right? How many of you know a porn star? And know that you know, and will admit it? How many of you have ever seen a UFO, or know somebody who's seen a UFO? Right? So where do you learn about it? You learn about it largely from the media. So that's why it gets the big. Bystanders, these would include people like your reference group. These would include your friends, your family. Oh, that's just a cult. It's like when I was interviewed for my book on sacred space, I said that I'm a positively disposed agnostic. which means I'd like to think that there's something out there, but I'm not smart enough to know, and by the way, neither is anybody else, right? So my mother reads this long interview in the Atlantic magazine, and guess what she keys on? I see you're an agnostic. That's how bystanders happen. Then there's the state, they have an interest. New religious movements very rarely get to identify themselves. And the academy, because people just don't read. I mean, how many of you go to Chapters and looking for your latest issue of the American Academy of Religion Journal? It just doesn't happen. So all of these can be broken out. And this is where things get complex. And this is what I think is the beauty of this model and the nightmare. Psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, historians, they have all studied cults, but they all bring different packages, different toolkits, and they all arrive with different agendas. So they just take psychology. In the history of the cult wars, there was split into basically two camps in the academy. And the question that I asked out of this is, how did those two camps influence that fuzzy little concept? What's the relationship? Okay? There was what I come calling anti-cult psychology, people like Margaret Singer, who said, who proposed the brainwashing hypothesis, that the only reason people join new religious movements is because they're brainwashed, because otherwise, why would you leave the United Church of Canada, for God's sake? And, like become a Catholic, unless you were brainwashed. By the way, the very first brainwashing indictment that was brought from somebody who had left a Protestant church and joined a Catholic church. So anti-cult psychologists, academics, were very powerful in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, trying to influence the state media and creating this institution that we know as the secular anti-cult. People who are feeding into that fuzzy little idea called cult. I'm a cult apologist, by the way, at least that's what I get called, because I don't automatically say that new religious movements are dangerous or evil or stupid. I am therefore an apologist for them. It's like a derogatory term. But if you actually look at people like me, Eileen Barker, David Bromley, Jeff Haddon, people like that, we actually know more about new religious movements because of this group than that group. So there is a way that the Academy has contributed to this discussion. Okay? Now, you can do the same map with porn. You have dedicated counter movements. What Wendy Kaminer called the McDworkinites, she was the very first one to use that term, so far as I have been able to find. Feminist anti-porn activists from the 80s, and there's a new rise of that I'll talk about in a few minutes, who sort of got into bed, which is the double entendre that is always used. And if you're going to write about porn, I got to tell you, it's the hardest thing in the world to avoid using double entendres. But they got in bed, as it were, with religious counter movements. So you had, radical feminists who would not be caught in the same time zone with people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, who are coming together to contribute to this fuzzy little idea. Then you've got the media, which is trying to sell advertising. Bystanders, people who will admit to porn, not admit to porn, say, I don't use porn, but do. The state, what the heck do we do about it? You should be regulating. You should be doing things because it's evil, because it's bad. Porn producers and consumers, they're going, what? We're making a lot of money. What's the big deal? I mean, the Academy, again, it's like way down in the corner, contributing to the discussion. We're here, right? And it's the same kind of thing. It's an interference pattern. If you were to take any one of these, you would have this idea of what porn is, but it cannot cover the entirety of the phenomenon because it's not taking into consideration the other stakeholder groups. So what I'm trying to work on is a model that will take into consideration the other stakeholder groups. So you can see how complicated this gets. A friend of mine said, hey, you got to read this book. It's really, really good because he's really, really smart. Okay. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who is now basically a freelance moralist with a really good agent.
Yeah.
Because he is out there. He's been at WLU a couple times. He spoke at the Congress. And so they said, well, you should read this book. So I go pick up this book, which is, by the way, 45,000 words, just so you know. And he's got a chapter in it on porn. So I'm reading this, and basically it's his story. It's a typical sort of immersive journalism story where he talks about going to the Adult Video Expo, or the Adult Entertainment Expo, which is a big trade show in Las Vegas. And from the moment you go in, it's like a horror show, right? It's filled with just the creepiest things imaginable that he's talking about. And he says things in it like all porn performers are drug addicts and prostitutes. He says that in print. It's not even close to being true, right? So, and I'm reading this, I'm going, wait a minute. I've read this before. Not that Chris Hedges has plagiarized it, but I'm thinking, I've read this before. So I started looking at other of the, and these are all published within the last 5 or 6 years. Gail Dines is a sociologist at Wheelock, and it's particularly important to pay attention to the image, the title, and especially the subtitle here. How porn has hijacked our sexuality, right? Pamela Paul is a journalist who did a poll with, I want to say Newsweek, but I could be wrong. How pornography is transforming our lives, our relationships, and our families. Robert Jensen, who is self-described as a disciple, that's the word that he uses, a disciple of Andrea Dworkin. Pornography at the End of Masculinity, that's the most disturbing of the covers I've seen. Ariel Levy, another journalist, Female Chauvinist Pigs, Women in the Rise of Raunch Culture. And my particular favorite, which is the porning of America. Because they're all trying to come up with the ugliest neologism for this phenomena. Pornographization, pornification, porning. And it's all sort of going towards this hypersexualization, the rise of porn culture, what it means and where we go from here. Now, all of them at one point say, we're not against sex. Right? But then when you read it, go, well, okay, but that's like, you know, the Puritans saying we're not against sex. You know, we're not against sex as long as you do it this way, right? And you do it our way. And I thought to myself, I've read all this before. Where have I read it? I read it when I was writing my dissertation on the Christian countercult movement. This is a book called The Culting of America. You could read these books side by side and just take, you know, put porn in for cults, and you're reading the same book, right? And because all of these, it's like all these books, these last 5 or 6 authors, it's like they all went to a conference, all talked to each other, all said the same thing, then all scattered to their different parts of the globe to write the same book. And there are chapters that are stacked, they're floor displayed, they're, you know, big deal. So then pornified is kind of like, it's like Margaret Singer, a very famous psychologist who was one of the driving forces in the anti-cult movement, especially behind brainwashing and thought control, the meta-narrative that controlled the anti-cult movement for the 80s. And it's very much like reading this book. Pornland was actually like reading Kingdom of the Cults. It was eerie, because what came about was they all used exactly the same argument mechanisms. Anecdotal atrocity tales. You know, an entire book, you know, and a whole chapter about one person's experience. Right? We all know the problem with anecdotal atrocity. Yes, bad things happen to people. But what happens is the bad things get built up into what I call worst case metonymy. That is, you take the worst case and you make it universal. You make it stand for the entire phenomenon. It's like people who say, Christopher Hitchens tends to do this, actually. He takes, you know, a worst example of something and builds it up as a condemnation of all, you know, Christianity or something. They have problematic statistics, questionable scholarship, emotional enlargement. These all fit together. What is the porn industry worth? Anybody know? In the billions? What is it? No.
I was agreeing to your billions.
Oh, billion, okay. In billions. If you read academic articles in peer-reviewed journals, if you read books, both pro and anti-porn, if you read blogs, you will find that it is worth about $97 billion a year. And what that is, it's more than Google, it's more than Microsoft, it's more than all professional football teams combined. It's also wrong, right? But everybody's quoting it. It's like you wrote a book and you quoted your book, and you wrote a book and you quoted your article, you wrote an article and you quoted your blog, but nobody goes back to the source. The $97 billion actually comes from a guy who makes, what did I say it was, David? Internet filter software. He makes anti-porn filter software so that you can put it on your computer to keep porn out. And he put it on his blog, which is called the Internet Filter Review. But if you don't know that you're looking at a blog, it actually looks like a newspaper, right? So when you think about where that number came from and how it's had an effect on what we consider, now the alarmism comes in. They say, wow, $97 billion, it's a horrible problem. That's sort of a Chicken Little attitude, because there's no de facto evidence that simply because it's $97 billion means that it's a problem. It's not 97, it's actually closer to 17, according to Forbes, which I think is a more reliable source than the Internet Filter Review. So then you have conventional pieties offered as evidence. Robin Morgan's famous quote about pornography. Anybody remember it? Pornography is the theory, rape is the practice. That's not analysis, that's a motto. But same thing. Refusal to consider alternative viewpoints. There are an awful lot of countercult people who are opposed to new religious movements, who absolutely refused to meet with members of new religious movements. Because we're not interested in what they have to say. Or they would only use, academics would only use the testimony of ex-members. You know, people who got out because they were deprogrammed. People who got out under very traumatic circumstances. Maybe they're actually kidnapped. Those are the people that they talked to and based their idea of this fuzzy little thing called cults. Andrea Dworkin was famous for not permitting any pro-pornography or anti-censorship position on a podium with her. Ignorance of relevant fields of inquiry. People learn about biology. These people, I had to learn what an amygdala is. You know, what an amygdala is. It's that little wee thing in the back of your brain that is, turns on your reward center. Right? I had to learn about that, but they don't. They don't think about that. Ideological commitment to moral inerrancy, a simplistic reduction of participants. When you think about a cult member, remember the thing was, it was a young man like Taylor, right? He's away from home. It's his first. I'm just going to pick on. That's okay. He's away from home. He's away from his family. His social support network is gone. He's lonely. He's not doing very well in school. He is. He's not doing very well in school. And somebody comes to him and says, you look lonely. Why don't you come join our cult? And that became the image that was held up in the media to the state, because the anti-cult movement pushed for what were called conservatorship laws. And a conservatorship law means that if Taylor joins a new religious movement that's on the list, we can actually remove his rights as an adult and place him in conservatorship because he is clearly non-compos. He's clearly not competent. Now, those never passed, but it's a little frightening to know that they were pushed. And they came out of this idea that people join new religions for one reason. That same thing is true in all of those books about people who were involved in pornography. They're all drug addicts. They all had some sort of childhood sexual abuse. They're all prostitutes. And in point of fact, it's yes, there are people who have had bad experiences. Of course, how absurd to think otherwise. But as a generalized statement, it is simply not true. It's based on a conviction rather than evidence. And the conviction, the controlling threat narrative is, for new religious movements, it was brainwashing. If I'm a cult leader, particularly powerful cult leader and say, "How you doing?" That's it. You're done.
Already.
That's right. You had me at hello, right? And and there's people who would write things like this that it's just that easy. One point, in fact, it isn't. There's not a shred of credible evidence that brainwashing works, right? Which is why they kept having to back away from it. Thought control and coercive control and stuff, right? Well, the controlling threat narrative for pornography is harm, the harm narrative. And even like the Nice Commission, which was terribly flawed, but for two women, was stacked top to bottom with social and moral conservatives, couldn't come out and say, yeah, we have a definite causal linkage. Okay? So I found, well, isn't that interesting? What we have here, of course, is the sociology of knowledge, which is what I do. So there are certain questions that drove me, because remember, porn, culture, they're just case studies to get at the model. The problem of practice, anybody know who this is? This is Karl Mannheim, Ideology and Utopia. It's Karl Mannheim. And one of the things that he said in Ideology and Utopia is, you have to consider the problem of practical life. That is, we don't think about everything all the time, so how do we come to think about the things that we do? That's an interesting question. How do we come to think about the things that we do? I call it proximate thresholds of instability. That is, when two worldviews bump up against one another, or an event bumps up against your worldview and creates this instability, this zone, that you have to, there are certain mechanisms that get invoked. For example, consider 9/16 of a second. A good sociologist should never be more than a couple of slides away from a solid concrete example. Consider 9/16 of a second. 9/16 of a second is a bit longer than eye blink. It's about the time it takes you to taste your coffee for the signal to travel to your brain and back to tell you it's too hot. It's roughly the same time as a snap of your fingers. It's way less time than it takes you to start your car. And just to put this in perspective for you, it is about the time it takes a .308 sniper rifle round to go the length of 5 football fields and kill a child in Aleppo or Sarajevo or Gaza, where things like this really matter. It's also exactly the time required to manufacture moral outrage.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, poor Janet. 9/16 of a second is what the FCC, by counting the frames in the camera, that's how long her breast was exposed. 9/16 of a second. The court case is still ongoing over that, and it's into the millions of dollars. That's their money going to fund that. Somebody's making a lot of money off this 9/16 of a second. So you have this idea of manufactured moral outrage. So then there's the problem of thinking differently. Why do we think differently about the same things, especially when we have the same data? Anti-porn activists think very differently about porn than the media, than bystanders, than the state, than porn producers, and than the academy. To the point where the question has to be asked from a social psychological standpoint. Are they even talking about the same thing? Are we even discussing the same phenomena? We may be looking at the same image or set of images or reading the same text, but are we talking about the same thing? That's a pretty profound question, I think, that can have ramifications. I teach religious studies, we deal with all the time. Are we talking about the same thing? My colleague at UMKC, Gary Ebersol, got a very poor student evaluation one time. The student said, Dr. Ebersol spent way too much time talking about Catholicism and not enough about Christianity. So clearly for that student, they weren't talking about the same thing. Then you've got the problem of, do we really think as individuals? How many times have you been told you got to learn to think for yourself? Right? As though that's a good thing. Trust me, on certain things you don't want me thinking for myself. Truly. How high do I set the oven for the roast? You don't want me thinking that for myself. Right? Truly. And most things in life, you don't want me thinking for myself. What I'm going to ask my wife, who's a gourmet cook. You want me to turn the oven on, or what do I turn it on to? Right? If I want to know something about Pentecostals, I'm going to go ask Adam. Because Adam knows way more about Canadian Pentecostals than I do. Right? I'm going to go ask him. I want tech advice. Where am I going to go? I'm going to go to David, or geek advice. I'm going to go to David. Right? I have reference groups. We don't really think as individuals. By the way, does anybody know who this is? This is Ludwig Fleck. He was a Polish physician who published in 1935 a little book called Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact. And basically he uses syphilis in the same way I am using cult porn and UFOs, as a way of developing a model of talking for how do people think about things. 40 years before Foucault was doing anything like this. Now, the reason you haven't heard of Ludwig Fleck is his book was published in 1935. It was nearly 50 years before it, or 45 years before it saw publication in English. And it was also long after a book most of us were made to read, Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But if you actually read Fleck and then read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, you will realize that the structure of scientific revolutions is not nearly as original as most people thought. Because it's very clear that Kuhn read this. He didn't plagiarize. It's not what I'm saying. But it's very clear that Fleck was the giant on whose shoulders Kuhn stood. Also, this is a very short book. Currently, the Rutgers sociologist, Aviator Zerubbabel, is the current sort of guy who's carrying this, what he calls social cognition. Now, how do we think about these things? Psychologists will recognize these. Religious studies scholars probably not so much. Confirmation bias, which is our tendency to bias information as true if we agree with it. We tend to regard things as true if we agree with them. Source dissociation, which is our propensity to forget where we learned something, especially if we agree with it. For example, this is why I have students in the US who are absolutely convinced that the US went ashore first on D-Day. I was going, well, no. The Canadians and the British didn't go ashore first and took out the heavy guns. You'd have never gotten to the beach. Oh, no, that isn't how it happened. Really, how do you know that? Well, I saw it on television. What do you think they saw? Saving Private Ryan, or Band of Brothers, right? But we tend, because of things that confirm our bias, these things all work together, not just categories. These things all work together because we tend to forget where we learned them. I said, oh, it must be true, I saw it on television. I call it the imprint fallacy. So Joey doesn't like going shopping with me. And she does now because I'm toned down. But I bore easily. So I was in the supermarket, and I tend to read like the National Enquirer out loud and comment on it. And this was the boxing snakes. Well, the front page story is the boxing snakes. Let's look at these boxing snakes. I have two questions. How do they get the little trunks to stay up? And how do they raise the winner's arm? And the person in front turns to me and goes, young man, it was a long time ago, young man, they wouldn't be allowed to print it if it weren't true. It's not true. There are people, lots and lots of people, and there's studies that have been done on this, who have this imprint fallacy, and it feeds into source. So the validity effect, the more times we hear something, especially from multiple sources, the more we tend to regard it as true. We could convince people that the Earth is flat if we just had enough people saying it. The availability heuristic, the more easily we can draw to mind an example of something, the more we are likely to regard it as true. Now you can see how just thinking about those stakeholder group little maps that I wrote start to feed into this. Because if you've got something that a media outlet is using to sell advertising space, you need to be real clear about this. CNN is not in the business of delivering news. It's in the business of providing shareholders with profit. Yes? News just happens to be the vehicle by which they do that. Right? So if we've got, something's happened, and we're going, in fact, so, give me an example. When you go back here, not now, go on CNN, and you can click on a very brief link of Christopher Walken and Colin Farrell reading the script of Honey Boo Boo Child. Now, who here doesn't know who Honey Boo Boo Child is? One. Okay, two. It's basically, you remember Pay a Quarter, See the Bearded Lady, See the Tattooed Man? It's the same thing, it just happens to be on television. Okay, but that's the availability heuristic. At work, is the more easily we can call something to mind, the more we tend to regard it as true. Expectation bias is kind of like confirmation bias, looking ahead. Psychologically, we recognize these as cognitive and intrapsychic resource management, because we have limited cognitive capacity. We don't have any idea how much it is, but we do know that it's limited. I'll give you an example. If I've set Denise a math problem, and so you're working on your math problem, right? And you turn your paper around, is this right? And I say, yep. You can almost feel your brain relax. You can almost feel, it's like cognitive resources are all of a sudden freed up to think about lunch, right? So you almost feel your brain relax. You've all had experiences like that, right? Or conversely, if you work for an hour, show me your pencil. Again, there's this kind of turtling, this sense that you bring in more resources. These are all designed through evolution to help us use what we need in terms of our cognitive resources, but not more than we need in any one situation. It's designed to reduce the cognitive load. Okay? But socially, and by the way, religious studies knows nothing about this, and they should. I actually put every one of these into ATLA, which is the American Theological Library Association. For religious studies scholars, it's the go-to search engine for academic articles. I put every one of those in as a search term and you get one hit back, not one. So if anybody's looking for a dissertation or a topic, you know what? Tell me how this doesn't explain religion, or at least help to explain religion. But it also, psychologically, they function as cognitive and intrapsychic resource managers. But socially, they function as reinforcement mechanisms for primary group membership, group cognition, and boundary maintenance. What I mean by that is your bias toward confirmation may be confirmed by someone in your group. Right? I'm going to go talk to Scott. I say, this Honey Boo Boo Child, what the hell is up with that? He goes, I know, dude. He's just confirmed, So, right? Coming out of theaters. All right, y'all go to movies. Who is this is what I thought of it, and you're the first one to speak? Interesting. I'm going to wait for somebody else to say what they thought of it, and then I'm going to chime in. Yeah, most people actually tend to be in that. My only thing was Titanic. Just 3 hours of my life I'm never getting back. We went with our best friends, and they're like, it's the saddest thing I ever saw. And I'm like, come on, man, there was room for him on the door. And you know what? Mythbusters proved that there was. Last week. Right? And the only thing that I like, the guy's hanging on I needed a sniper in the funnel or a submarine in the water, right, for it to be a movie I wanted to. The guy's hanging on the thing, and he falls, he hits the prop on the way down. There's that nice low A440 tone. It's like, boom. Yeah, that was good. I was like, cool. It's like, come on, what is this freaking... So, but nobody cares what I think about Titanic. It was $600 million or $1 billion. How much? Nobody cares what I think. But I was bound and determined I was not going to follow the herd on this one. Because I'm usually the one to ask, so what did you think about it, Glenn? And then, because I don't want to offend you, but, if you thought, oh, it was really good, I'm going to say, I thought it was shit. I don't want to do that, because that's just rude, right? So, but with Titanic, I come out, I said, I can't believe the boat sank. There was 500 people waiting to go into the next show. I said, the boat sinks, Chris is like trying to get me out of there. But we do this. We have this group confirmation. And take something like source dissociation. What's your name?
Mateo.
Mateo, you emailed me, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Awesome. Did you get my response?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Mateo says, I said, I saw this thing on TV where Titanic was really a submarine. And it's still lying down there, waiting to, shuttle, lost artworks from Europe after the Second World War. And Mateo says, I saw that too. Right? And, Nazis have UFO bases on the moon. Did you know that? If you've seen Iron Sky, you do. Right? So these things not only work psychologically, but they also work socially. And this has not been well researched at all. So then there's the problem of proof. How do groups, what Fleck called thought collectives, determine relevant domains and species of evidence? This is Michael Shermer, the founder of the Skeptic and founder of the Skeptic Society. He wrote a book called Why People Believe Really Weird Things, which is really why people shouldn't believe things that Michael Shermer thinks are weird. So this is the question that I have. And this, you could plug in UFOs, you could plug in cults. If pornography is such a clear and present social danger, as these books that I have been reading suggested, then why are the arguments against it routinely so weak and so poorly made? Also, the same question for cults. If cults are such a clear and present social danger, why are the arguments against them routinely so weak and so poorly made? Now, I'm not interested in proving one side or the other. What I'm interested in this interaction that generates thought collectivity. How do we think as groups? Right? And if the arguments for either are so weak and so poorly made, then why do so many people remain committed to particular ideas? If there is no evidence, no physical evidence for UFO abductions, why do millions of people believe it happened? Right? Then you've got the problem of persistence. In the face of sometimes overwhelming evidence to the contrary, how and why do groups cling to particular beliefs, like a 6-day literal creation with Adam, even a talking snake? Which, by the way, according to the last Pew poll, maybe, 46% of Americans, according to that poll, believe in a special creation in which human beings were created much as we are now, sometime within the last 10,000 years. So next time you're in the US, when you go to a conference, when you go on a holiday, and there's 10 people in the room, look around and go, which ones are you? Why do people believe what they believe? This is what I'm interested in. How do they reinforce their beliefs in the face of challenge? I don't care if you believe the moon is inhabited by one-eyed Episcopalian Nazi kangaroos. I don't care. I'm interested in why you think that and how you demonstrate it, because that tells us how we think and how we evolve to think as human beings. How do you maintain your beliefs in the face of immediate and conclusive disconfirmation? If I can show you you're wrong, and you look at me and you go, no, I'm not. R2, am not. R2, am not. Right? That's how it happens. Of course, we're dealing with social psychologists, and this is the question of cognitive dissonance. Unfortunately, anybody know where cognitive dissonance came from as a theory?
Festinger and the failed prophecy.
Yeah, what was he investigating?
How when their prophecy failed of that the world didn't end and they weren't rescued by aliens or whatever it was, that how what would happen and how could they maintain their belief?
I have 6 social psychology textbooks. First 2 textbooks in my office. All of them talk about cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the difference between expectation and experience, and how we manage that difference. Put simply, all 6 of them talk about it. Cognitive dissonance is very important. Blah blah blah. And they all mention Festinger, but none of them mention what Festinger was doing. Festinger was sitting with a group of UFO cultists, we would call them, or they would come to be called, led by a woman named Mrs. Keach, who believed in the mid-1950s, again, influenced by media stories of UFOs buzzing Washington, that Space Brother Jesus, that's the name, I swear to God, Space Brother Jesus was going to come and rescue them on a particular night as the Earth was being destroyed. I think it was floods or earthquakes or something, comets, whatever. So Festinger and his graduate students got wind of this. And they said, hey, could we come and watch you? And basically it's like, let's see what happens to them when it doesn't happen. And I guess they'd be there if it did, so they win either way. The lore in new religious movements is that actually the number of the group was outnumbered by social scientists. I'm sorry, right, for this thing. But that's where it came from. But most people who have talked about cognitive dissonance, either from religious studies perspective, psychology, or social psychology, tend to focus on what I call big ticket items. High intensity, right? Failure of prophecy. Something gets built up, doesn't happen. How do you deal with the letdown? I think that we're dealing with low intensity cognitive dissonance management all the time. In what frustration of expectations. Right? We expect a certain thing to happen, it doesn't. How do we manage that? We are constantly invoking these mechanisms to allow us to constantly manage these little bubbles, these thresholds of instability that are pounding against our worldview. Right? And so I think understanding how this works in the context of all those stakeholder groups, this is part of helping this model along. Then there's the problem of communication, which is how does information input and management affect information output, which is, of course, propaganda theory. You all know this. Those of you who teach statistics. I learned math when I was in sabbatical. I did. I taught myself. I'm sort of at mid-second year algebra. So I'm so excited because I've never known how to do math before. I was part of a classroom experiment when I was in my grade 6 where they let 11-year-olds decide which classes they were going to go to. And I always struggled with math, so guess what I didn't do? So I didn't go to math for grade 6 or grade 7. But I don't know what that is now. No, it's function. And a function is basically input. The function, which when you explain it to students, is it's like a machine that changes it into things, right? That's the analogy that's used. And then you get an output. You get however many independent variables. They go into this. With this function, they will always produce that variable. Right? Did I get that right? Did I get the IVDV on the right side of that? Yes. But here's the thing. Psychology, sociology have been wedded to this kind of unidirectional monopolar model. And the problem is, it's developed because of the way these disciplines emerged historically and tried to set themselves apart. It's because of the way professionalism has worked. Right? But the problem is, when you only have this kind of a way, if this is your hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. And sociology of religion has gone down some very hard roads because of this. This whole secularization hypothesis, and people becoming less where this is not true. It's 12 eggheads talking to one another. Right? So I think that the model that I'm proposing, I'm working on, actually says, we have to move past. This provides us a little bit of information, but we need to find a way to talk about how all of these intersect, and I haven't got it clear in my mind how I'm going to do this, but this is where we're headed. How does media impact this, and then impact the state, skeptics, bystanders, all of these? How do these things work together to create this social reality, this thought collective? So, why cults, porn, and UFOs? Because the title is way sexier than an ecological model of social cognition. Okay, that's one thing. We'll sell more paper. So, why cults, porn, and UFOs? When Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote Manufacturing Consent, They said in the foreword to manufacturing consent, essentially, anybody can prove that people like apple pie. I'm paraphrasing. What they did is they took what they considered were the hardest test cases for their particular model. Right? And I'm doing this pretty much for the same reason. Porn and cults, and you remember I used these both in scare quotes, porn and cults both present as cases that are obvious to an awful lot of people. Porn is harmful, porn is evil, must keep porn away. It's very clear. You can see all kinds of that. You know? Cults the same way. Religions are evil. The cult wars are still ongoing. They've been, they've been outsourced to Europe by and large, but they're still ongoing. Of course, joining Hare Krishna is wrong. And of course, if you're a Scientologist, you're crazy. You know? They present as obvious. So they present very, very hard test cases for the model. I use UFOs largely because I think that anything is improved with the addition of UFOs. But also because the same cognitive dynamics are at play, yet there isn't the emotional valence. It's almost like a control case, but not quite. Because it's not enough to say, it seems to me, we know that all people who join new religious movements are not crazy or deluded. We know this. Because, let's face it, what new religions believe is not inherently weirder than conventional religious beliefs. It's just that we're more comfortable with conventional religious beliefs. Right? If not all people are if not all porn performers and producers are products of child sexual abuse, then what does that say about the argument that all porn performers are products of childhood sexual abuse? I don't know. If porn is such a social danger, why don't we see more evidence of that danger? Right? If it's such a big deal. So these are the kind of questions that percentage are. UFOs have less of an emotional valence because there are people who believe all the same dynamics are at play, but there doesn't seem to be as much at stake, unless there are aliens and they are invading, right? So anyway, that's what I read about and thought deeply about for a year. So I do appreciate you giving up. We got like 5 minutes, but I do appreciate you giving up your lunchtime to come and hear me ramble. So thank you. Cookies and tea, but I imagine if anybody has questions. Yes, the little boy in the back.
Yeah. The last few slides, maybe you talked about it more like this. You had a picture of Michel Foucault in there. In what you're talking about, what role does discourse and subjectivity within a discourse play a role in what you're?
It's central. It's central. It's the whole thought collective. Foucault often gets interpreted in terms of power and ideology, when I think that kind of skews his valence. I think it ought to be where you are suggesting this notion of how discourse forms reality. Right? Also, I just like that picture. But yeah, Foucault is. I find Foucault tremendously difficult to read. And if I was going to look for a model of a writer to follow, his would not be it. I would probably, my current model, and I'm not suggesting that I'm even of the same species as this guy, but Steven Pinker. That's the model of communication. But the idea of a discourse community is not fundamentally different than what Ludwig Fleck called a thought collective. The difference where community is used is this is the reason that Fleck uses collective, is it doesn't have that same we're all in this together vibe that community does. Collective has this sense that you can have differing agendas and different thoughts and feelings about things.